Hello, hi. Warm greetings from Heeracht here in Amsterdam, where I am right now, alone and all socially distanced in the Goethe Institute. My name is Sophia, and I'm a program curator here at the Goethe Institute Amsterdam, and it is truly a great pleasure to welcome everyone, our viewers, panelists, and partners, to the first chapter, the kick-off meeting, or rather digital encounter and gathering of the series Crisis Imaginaries, starting right now with the first chapter of Climate Transformations. This series, Crisis Imaginaries, is a collaboration between Framer Framed and the Goethe Institute Netherlands. Framer Framed is a very inspiring platform for contemporary art, visual culture, and critical theory and practice right now in the east of Amsterdam, and they are open again. And if you are in Amsterdam, I recommend visiting them. Just reserve a spot in advance. They present a variety of exhibitions in collaboration with emerging and established international curators and artists, as well as an extensive public program. The Goethe Institute is the Cultural Institute of Germany, with a global reach, and our cultural and educational programs encourage intercultural dialogue and enable cultural involvement. Thank you, Framer Frame, for this collaboration. It's truly great. From my perspective, the idea of this project came from a sense of urgency. Urgency because whilst being in the middle of a global pandemic and thus experiencing the crisis as a lived, real state of exception, the importance of responding to the climate crisis at a similar scale, as well as the possibilities of actually doing so, became urgently present. And even whilst moving from acute crisis to recovery phase, maybe, we know that COVID-19 is the sprint, as the climate crisis is the marathon. The two crises intertwine on many aspects of climate justice. Today, we ask what transformations are necessary and imaginable at this turning point history. Let me introduce you shortly Jeff Diamanti, who will guide us through the conversation today. Jeff is Assistant Professor of Environmental Humanities at the University of Amsterdam. With Imre Zeeman, he's the editor of Energy Cultures, Art and Theory Beyond Oil, on Oil and Beyond, and with Amanda Butskis, he co-organizes at the Moraine, an ongoing research project on the political ecology of glacial retreat in Greenland. He is also co-editor of the Climate Realism book and journal collection. And his first book, Climate and Capital in the Age of Petroleum, Locating Terminal Landscapes, is forthcoming with Bloomsbury. And before I give the word to Jeff, who will introduce the panelists and actually start the conversation, I would also like to thank quickly our other partner for this edition, which is Uitgeverij Pluim, the Dutch publisher of Carola Rackete book, Tijd voor Actie, as it is called in Dutch. Thank you as well for being our partner on this first chapter. But now, Jeff, the word is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you both to Framer Framed and Goethe for hosting this wonderful event, and our three guests or panelists. It's quite a fantastic group of people and so many varied approaches to, the larger theme of this session, which is climate imaginaries. It's wonderful to be part of this conversation. I think we're going to be joined very briefly by Carola Rackete, who may or may not be on a boat. So we'll find out about that in a moment. So, the work of these three panelists is really inspiring and in fact inspires multiple forms of collaboration, which I think Framer Framed as an institution has been really good at fostering over the years. I think it's interesting that in a kind of artistic or cultural context, we're having conversations about environmental justice. We're speaking with lawyers, speaking with a captain of a ship, and we're speaking with a visual artist. And I think it signals the kinds of experimental forms of thinking and interdisciplinary forms of research that are required for us to really push a number of political projects and that cohere in the arts, and in fact signals the way in which the arts in particular can be a unique kind of space for experimental thinking. And I know Jonas's work, Jonas Staal, who I'll introduce in a moment, has been really at the forefront of experimenting with these kinds of forms. But nevertheless, there are so many different kinds of crises that I think are signaled by the title of this session, right? Crisis Imaginaries. And I think we all recognize intuitively that they're intertwined or entangled, right? If we think about the coronavirus, as Sophia was just talking about in the conversation before we started, as well as it sort of crosses paths with extractive resource industries, and the long arc of climate change, which we're in the thick of right now. I think it's incumbent upon us to always sort of specify what we mean by crisis and the kinds of institutional and structural sources of those crises, instead of labeling, the crisis as a sort of singular event. But so one of the things I like about the approaches of these three thinkers is that they really come at the question of crisis from three different angles. Whether it's the question of capitalism, or the long arc of colonialism, or if it's climate change as such, and the kind of political ecologies that are under pressure as a consequence of global warming. So my job as facilitator today is to sort of help, a conversation emerge, knowing that there will be some collaborative projects on the horizon for these three interlocutors, but knowing as well that the shape of those projects is still to come. And so it's really exciting to be able to sort of think with these three as those projects form. But nevertheless, one of the things I want to say that I feel coheres across each of the sort of bodies of work that our interlocutors bring are sort of threefold. And I want to just put these on the table quickly before I turn the floor over to Radha. The first is the question of rights, which is an immediate segue to the work of Radha D Souza. So the political ecology of rights, right? It's distinct from, I think we have to insist that it's distinct from the purview of the nation state, even if the nation state claims jurisdiction over rights. Whether it's the right to breathe, or protection from ecocide, which is something that Carola speaks about in some of her writing, or the right to hospitality, a kind of universal right to hospitality. These are constitutive rights of political life as such, as opposed to rights that are constituted by the nation state. Clean drinking water, clean air, protection from police brutality. These are all kinds of rights that precede the realm of the nation state. And on this question of these sort of universal rights, Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe says in a recent article on what he calls the universal right to breathe, quote, "Before this virus, the coronavirus, humanity was already threatened with suffocation. If war there must be," he continues, "it cannot so much be against a specific virus as against everything that condemns the majority of humankind to a premature cessation of breathing. Everything that fundamentally attacks the respiratory tract, everything that in the long reign of capitalism has constrained entire segments of world population, entire races, to a difficult panting breath and life of oppression. To come through this constriction would mean that we conceive of breathing beyond its merely biological aspect, and instead as that which we hold in common, that which by definition eludes all calculation, by which I mean," and this is the title of his piece, "the universal right to breathe." So I see across the work of these three interlocutors a putting of pressure on the very concept of rights, and the sovereignty that the forms of sovereignty that lay claim to those rights. And so that's one thing I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about, is the way that rights come in and out of focus based on the notion of sovereignty that we're talking about. The second is the question of power. This is really, Jonas Stahl's work really is compelling and fantastic and experimental on the question of power. So power is distributed in ways that the police and the state, as well as corporations, really can't bear. And we know they can't bear it because they precisely are nervous at all times to police the boundaries of those things. Power can be performed, it can be dismantled, but it can also be taken, right? And there are different political traditions that I think on the left we draw from that resolve into one of those three categories: performing power, dismantling power, or taking power. An art installation can be turned into a tribunal against climate crimes. A research vessel can save bodies from the Mediterranean. The promise of social justice can transcend the limits of institutional liberalism, right? Power can be malleable across these different forms. But this question of power and its distribution, it raises another question, which is really my third that I want to sort of put on the table as a frame for what we might talk about following each of the presenters' short contributions, which is really this is the third, right? What collective political forms bridge the gap between the artistic, the legal, and the environmental? So there's lots of political forms, right? There's parties, there's class action lawsuits, there's Supreme Courts. These are all political forms. And every political form does an enormous amount of work within a restricted domain of the political. But one of the things I really like about thinking with the work of each of these interlocutors is they all seem to be really advancing the genres of political forms that we might take seriously and take up and experiment with today, given how malnourished our existing democratic political forms are. So for instance, I'll just leave it at this, here are some other political forms we might take up and think with. The Tribunal is one. I mentioned that because it's one of the future collaborative projects by Radha D Souza and Jonas Staal at Frame of Frame next year, which I hope we can talk a little bit about. Well, there's other things like a declaration, that's a political form, a manifesto, a commune, as we're seeing right now in Seattle. A biome might be thought of as a political form, right? A political form that brings together actors that are both human and non-human, or a parliament. I know Jonas has thought a lot about experimenting with the parliamentary form. A tributary, a classroom, right? An autonomous zone. So the question is, what kinds of political forms bridge the gap between the artistic, the legal, the environmental, especially in a context like this where we're thinking within virtually the structure of an arts and culture institute. Okay, so if power is distributed and malleable, then what forms could it take? What forms could power take when the world we want requires the dismantling of so many oppressive and destructive structures? A world that cares for something like the universal right to breathe. So those are some of the thoughts that I was playing with as I spent a lot of time reading through the bibliographies and artistic works of each of our interlocutors. I see Carola Rackete is now here. She's joined us. I'm wondering if she's ready to take the floor or if she's still getting settled. But I'll just quickly introduce her, assuming that she's ready to go. So Carola Rackete is, Captain Carola Rackete studied at the Maritime Academy in Elspeth and then studied nature management at Ormskirk, England. She sailed the Meteor and the Polar Stern on the research, which are both research ships, the Greenpeace Arctic Sunrise, and other ships for the British Antarctic Survey. And since 2016, she's been working in her spare time on the ships and planes of NGOs such as Sea-Watch that save people on the Mediterranean Sea. In June 2019, as I'm sure many of you heard and know about, she ignored the Italian government's ban on mooring and brought 40 refugees fished out of the Mediterranean into the port of Lampedusa. Her arrest became world news, and her ship, the Sea-Watch 3, has since become a symbol for those who no longer wish to stand by and watch as human lives are systematically prevented from being saved. Welcome, Carola. I'll turn the floor over to you.
Hello, good evening, and thank you very much for the invitation. I hope you can hear me. Wonderful. Yeah. I've just been a bit delayed, unfortunately, to the talk. So I would like to start by really pointing out that the climate crisis is happening now. Especially in the West, we really like to talk about it in a frame of saying that it's something which would be happening later. Particularly now with the corona crisis, a lot of people say that we have to focus on corona now and climate is something which will be happening later and we should deal with it afterwards. But I think we really must not forget that the climate crisis has been happening and is happening all the time. And we should focus on something which I would typically call multi-solving, meaning that whatever actions we are taking now, they should have benefits both for the situations which we're facing now and for the future. And there we can see also some obviously very clear common ground between the environmental breakdown, and part of that is the climate crisis, and the huge inequalities which we see when we observe who is affected by the corona crisis. So we have seen for sure that in the US, for example, it's first and foremost Black people who are dying in huge numbers. We have the same in the EU, the same in Sweden, Norway, and so on, where it's mainly migrant communities, for example, people who have lower incomes, who just cannot afford to stay at home, who are affected by the corona crisis. And we can see how this inequality, which existed before, now is intensified by this crisis. And the absolutely same thing is happening for the climate and the environment. So we should, as activists, we should really not get delayed in demanding actions which would help to resolve our climate predicament in this current moment. Really now is the moment to push for progressive solutions to the economic problems which we are going to face as a result, basically, of this growth-based economic system. Because with the economic systems which we're currently operating in, and the communist system was in fact one of them, where nature is seen just as a resource to exploit, and where we think that everything can be growing forever, we either have that economic growth which at some point is facing the physical boundaries of the planet, which we are seeing right now, that the climate system is basically out of control. We have reached potentially 9 of 15 tipping point systems in the climate system, according to some of the top climate scientists, which could cause cascading effects of climate breakdown, leading us to a hothouse state on the planet. Or we have that economic recession. Another thing isn't really possible in the capitalist system. Either you're growing or there's recession, and both of them are just really terrible for humanity. So the question is, how do we get out of that? Like, how do we create a completely different economy, a different society, and so on? And that is where, for example, the IPBES, which is something like the IPCC for climate, which is doing the same for ecosystems and biodiversity, is asking for transformative change. And it's a report which is compounded by thousands of scientists. So we're really not just saying that as activists, this is founded in the science when we are demanding that we actually need transformative change. We need to get away from a society which is based on values of competing with each other for wealth, for wanting always and always more of things which are actually destroying the planet. Because even a green economy is fundamentally using resources of this planet. And there have been countless economic studies which have shown that green growth just isn't possible on this planet due to the rebound effect, due to the still comparatively low rate of technical innovation, the lack of recycling, and so on. So we really need that transformative change. And there is something, again, which is connected to what is happening with the migrants at the European border. There's this concept generally of othering, of saying like, these people over there, they're different from me. And that same thing happens with nature and ecosystems as well. So the only reason that we actually emotionally can allow other people or nature to be exploited in this way is that we do not perceive them as similar to us. This is the only way that our societies can actually make this emotional disconnect. And I think to achieve change, we have to create narratives of our common human experience, of showing that the people who by chance have grown up on the other side of the border have exactly that same human experience which we have as well. And the question really is, how can we create a larger us? So when we see in the corona crisis that many media, for example, are saying that corona actually leads to the fact that communities are helping each other, that is definitely true. It's true that we typically humans help people in their in-groups. So we help our family, we help our friends, we help people who we know, maybe the people in our street, in our community, in our town. But then it's the question, how do we extend that feeling of who is in my in-group towards the whole planet, towards the whole humanity, towards the point where we say that our actions, which we take locally, the consumption patterns which we have here in the global north, they affect us globally. And how do we connect to the whole of humanity? That is the core question. How can we get away from this competitiveness between groups to a phase shift where we would all see each other as connected? And that doesn't only mean all human beings, but also the non-human animals. Because here in our Western societies, we do have usually a very strong view in which we see humans as being superior over nature. That's also part of the Christian foundation, which is displayed like that. But for example, in China, you have many more people who see themselves in a web of life. That is the traditional Chinese culture, but it's also within many, many other indigenous groups, which say very clearly that in their worldview, the human is just one part of all the living beings. And I think we as human animals should be just a lot more modest. And we should see that if we destroy the environment we are depending on and that we are part of as well, and that we're really part of the nature which surrounds us, then we could potentially reach a transformation. But it's going to be a very, very profound change in how we view ourselves and how we view our connection to all the other living beings on this planet.
Thank you, Carola, and I'm so glad you could join us. I will refrain from asking questions until we have all three speakers put some thoughts on the table. But that was a really fantastic and compelling start with a really, I think, challenging arc, right, from the question of critiquing a logic of accumulation around which the sovereign Western subject coheres towards a rethinking of the very sort of biosymbiotic entanglements of different forms of life across the planet, which I think is a very challenging political project for us to be advancing, but is absolutely the necessary one. And so that brings us back to the question of sort of what kinds of forms allow that to unfold. It's my great pleasure to introduce next Radha D Souza, who is an academic and a social justice activist. I'm just going to switch my screen. I'm not sure if me switching between speaker and gallery view is actually translating into the YouTube feed or not, but somebody on the back end can correct me if I'm doing this wrong. Radha is also a writer and a critic from India. She's lived and worked in New Zealand and currently lives in the UK. As an academic, Radha teaches law at the University of Westminster, but works across disciplines straddling development studies, geography, sociology, history, social theory, comparative philosophy, science, technology, and society studies, and resource conflicts, as well as international political economy. As a social justice activist, Radha has worked with trade unions and the democratic rights movements in India, with anti-globalization movements and Asia-Pacific workers' solidarity campaigns. In New Zealand and in the UK, she works with Campaign Against Criminalizing Communities to support communities impacted by Britain's anti-terrorism laws, besides doing solidarity work for movements in India. Radha practiced in the fields of constitutional law and public interest litigation in India. She's given up legal practice, however, to devote more time to public education and social justice issues. Radha's work focuses on third world and global justice issues, and it's driven by her commitment to justice and her dream, some may call this a fantasy, that tomorrow will be better than today. Her accolades are wide and varied, and you can find them on the events page for this session. But I will just mention the most recent book, What's Wrong with Rights, Social Movements, Law, and Liberal Imaginations, which I think gets right to the heart of the kinds of the practical questions that we're playing with or thinking about right now in this session. That is to say, the question of rights, who has access to rights and who determines the shape of rights. I'll turn the floor over to you now, Radha, and welcome, and it's very nice to meet you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And thank you to Frame a Frame for organizing this and for inviting me to contribute to this discussion, which I'm very much looking forward to. I will just begin with, I'll frame my talk around two major existential angst that is troubling all of us, whether we are in the north, in the south, third world, first world, west, rest, wherever. And this existential angst that is troubling us, one is climate change. We are worried that snows are melting, icebergs are melting, rain is not coming in my part of the world, and so on. And the second angst is large-scale migration. And in Europe, people are worried that too many people are coming in. And in our part of the world, in the developing countries, people are worried that they are forced to leave home. So it's both ways. And I want to just play with this idea, with this concept of climate, the concept of climate and crisis. And then maybe flag up a few points that I think we need to focus on to address Jeff's question about power and the interplay of art, environment, and law, which he laid out so well. So coming to this concept of climate, we use the word climate, at least in English language, and that's the only European language I know. So in English language, at least, we use the word climate in two ways. One is in relation to geological time and space. So when we talk about, a temperate region, or when we talk about, arid regions or whatever, these are geological formations which have occurred over a very long period of time and over a very long space area, regions. And that has again created very distinctive kinds of cultures, societies, ways of living, language. For example, Northern Canadian indigenous people have 40 words for snow, whereas in my language, which is Tamil, we have only one word. So there is a lot of things on that. The other sense in which we use the word climate is something much more immediate. For example, when we say the political climate in America is not good, or when we say the investment climate is not good. And that meaning of climate is very immediate. It's here and now. The migrant crisis is an here and now crisis. And so we see two very different time-space scales for understanding crisis. And the point I want to make is that both these levels or scales of crisis are inseparably linked. You cannot deal with one without dealing with the other. I want to come now to the concept of crisis. crisis is essentially something that is temporary. It's a flash. It happens, and the expectation is that crisis will go away because it's an exceptional situation. And after a crisis, we will go back to normal. But I think one of the things that is we have to think about is, if crisis becomes permanent, if we just go from one crisis to the next, to the next, to the next, then the state of crisis is a permanent one. It becomes part of our being. It becomes part of our existential situation. And I think it's important to remember, to recall this, because everyone now is speaking about the corona crisis and the pandemic and whatever else. But we tend to forget that there is another kind of pandemic, and that is the pandemic of crisis. We just look at the last 10, 12 years. From 2008 banking crisis, then there was a housing bubble, there was the financial crisis in Argentina, in Venezuela, then it came to Greece and Italy, and so on and so on and so forth. Then we had the crisis in Afghanistan, we had the crisis in Syria, we had the crisis in Libya, we had the crisis in Somalia. It goes on and on. And even when it comes to corona, you have SARS, you had MERS, you had Ebola, and of course you had AIDS. And so it goes on. So there is, and I think it would be interesting for, and I invite, the listeners here to go back and look at the newspapers and see if there was 1 year when there was no crisis. Yeah, just 1 year when there was no crisis. So this has become an existential condition, and therefore the angst. But we are not able to put our fingers on the angst. So we either focus on this climate, or the immediate climate, or the long-term climate. Now, even as we speak about the COVID-19 crisis, there is already another crisis waiting to happen, which is a recession. And people are already talking about it. And when the recession is over, we know from modern history that all crises are settled by war, and preparations for war against China are already happening. And if you remember, Obama's Pivot to Asia initiative, and of course, John Pilger's documentary on the coming war with China. So the question is, what do we do? Yeah. And I want to just flag up 3 issues, and as 3 steps to addressing what Jeff wanted us to talk about. One is that, and all 3 issues have to do with knowledge systems, with our knowledge systems that we operate, whether you are in art, whether you are in environment, or whether you are in law or other kinds of social sciences. One is, I think it's important to recognize that nature does not need us. We need nature. And therefore, if we need nature, because we cannot live without it, nature will go on. If there is a nuclear winter, the chemical reactions will still happen, hot will become cold, whatever it is, earth will still rotate, all those things will go on. It's we who will not be there. And this is a very, very important issue to understand, because most of the time when we talk about climate crisis, we talk about doing something for nature. We have to do something about our own behavior, and that's the essential issue here. And what might that be? And in my view, I think we need to fundamentally rethink the meaning of science. Because if we look at science and scientific knowledge, modern science does 2 things. One is it wants to conquer nature. That's a primary agenda for science, to conquer nature, to defeat it, to overcome it. And the second thing that science does is that it wants to create, a very efficient means of killing people. So from, airplanes, we went to, fire, all kinds of stealth jets, etc., etc. And now we are into robotic warfare and whatever else. So quick and efficient means of killing people. This is the mission of science. And that is because science has been captured by the military-industrial complex. So if this has to reverse, science has to come back to ordinary people. The farmers, the electricians, the plumbers, the tailors, they have to come and start thinking about technologies. And science has to answer two types of questions. First, not killing people, not conquering nature, but how can we live with nature again? And because we have for 500 years abused nature, how can we live today so that we can allow nature to regenerate itself? Because we still have to live today. We can't say we are not going to grow food or not eat bananas because of that. So this is a fundamental knowledge challenge in the domain of science. The second cause issue that I want to focus on is human relationships. Yeah, and I think it's the European Enlightenment that invented the idea of modern rights. And I emphasize modern because in ancient Europe, rights did not have the same meaning. When Greek philosophers talked about rights, it was more in the field of moral philosophy, right as opposed to wrong. Yeah, but right as a legal concept that disintegrates societies and turns us into right-bearing individuals so that we can enter into contracts. And everything can be contracted today. As a woman, I can contract my womb. And there are a lot of London law firms who write surrogacy contracts and go through all of those things. And it's real. It's not a metaphorical ways of saying. And many women in India who don't understand anything of these contracts, but out of poverty agree to bear children, it's become a huge social problem. So if this is the thing, then I think it is important to acknowledge and understand and deal with the issue that there are certain things that are higher, on a higher plane than any human rights or property rights or constitutional rights or electoral rights or any of those things. So what are these things that are higher than all these other rights that we speak of? And in my view, there are two things that are fundamental to human existence. One is, as human beings, we must have our body, our physical body, which we can use to labor, to work, basically, because work is an essential condition of human life. So you take away a person's capacity to work if you take away their capacity to labor, whether it's through slavery, indentured labor, or sweatshops that make our Nike shoes and whatever. And then the second thing is, if you take away a person's means to livelihood and subsistence, you take away their land, take away their water, take away their forests, you are taking away their means to live. And therefore, these two things have to override everything else, everything that we do. That's my second point. And that is also a knowledge question. The third thing, and that's my final point now, is if you accept that these two principles are fundamental, then the question is, where do we start? So if the problem is created by the European Enlightenment, then I think the solution has to come from that challenging that knowledge base. It has to come from another renewed enlightenment, if you like, yeah, which in my view, the European Enlightenment was the most unenlightened because that's what has brought us to this condition and this situation. And what is essential about the European Enlightenment to understand is its institutions. I think there is Rosenberg who says that Europe's wealth comes more from institutional innovation than from capital or labor or technology or any of those things. And that means in the contemporary context, we need to question whether corporations are persons. Is Monsanto equal to Radha D Souza? Yeah, because the law says that we are equal. And these are the institutions that we seldom challenge. Is the state equal to community? Because the state is an institution based on bureaucracy and army and police force. Without that, there is no state. So how can we substitute it for community? Is the international community really a community? Because it's a group of states. So these kind of institutional innovations that sustain modern societies, we cannot get to those very nice thoughts we have about environment and about people and migrants and all those issues if we don't address these fundamental institutional questions. And that has to come from Europe, because it's those institutions created by the European Enlightenment that has become now a locust on the earth, to my thing. I'll just conclude by saying, so where does that leave us with the question of how can art, environment, and law come together? Things. One of the things that neoliberalism has done is completely undermine the spaces for philosophy. And it's philosophy that unifies, that provides, that underpins all those three things. All those three things, and many others for that matter, are underpinned by a common worldview. And in each sphere, we need to look at the underlying philosophical premises. Today, in fact, most universities, at least in the Anglo-American world, have closed down philosophy departments. And so people like me have to look for artists like Jonas to talk about philosophy, because there's no other space to talk about these things. What is human purpose? Why are we on this world? What is our ethics? What is our duty to each other? What is our duty to these questions, which are so fundamental to what is human existence? These questions, we no longer have a space to talk about it. And this is what the knowledge systems have done, removed our capacity to think about our condition, to think about human purpose, to think about human destiny. And I think we need to create the spaces to bring them back. And I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Well, Radha, thank you so much. That was wonderful. And I think the final point you're making really actually answers the question, like, what's the role of the artistic institution or the cultural institution like Frame or Frame, right? Here we are having the conversation about philosophy in the midst of convergent crises. And to get back to your point, I mean, the paradox of crises produced by neoliberalism is precisely that. Amidst these crises is the moment when it's most urgent to think really critically about the kinds of things we take as a given or as normal, but they're also precisely the times when austerity guts the spaces that otherwise would host those conversations. So that makes me really excited to be having this conversation. And the other thing, you know, the first point you made about the new ethical standards of knowledge production, I think that's a really great place for us to pick up the conversation in a moment. Sort of whether it's decolonizing the university or it's the renewed enlightenment that you're talking about. I think these are really provocative ways for us to carry the conversation forward, which is maybe actually a good transition for some of the really fantastic and experimental projects that Jonas Staal has been working on for a number of years. So let me just he doesn't really need that much of an introduction, but Jonas Staal is a Dutch visual artist whose work deals with the relation between art, propaganda, and democracy. And he's the founder of the artistic and political organization New World Summit, which started in 2012 and is ongoing, as well as the campaign New Unions 2016 and ongoing. With BAK, Basis voor Actuele Kunst Utrecht, he co-founded the New World Academy from 2013 to 2016. And with Florian Malzeker, he is currently directing the Utopian Training Camp, Training for the Future, which began in 2018. And with Laure Provoost, he is co-administrator of the Obscure Union, which I spent lots of time reading about today. I can't wait to talk about. His projects have been exhibited widely at venues such as the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam and Moderne Muziek in Stockholm, as well as the 7th Berlin Biennale, the 31st Sao Paulo Biennale, the Oslo Architecture Triennale, the Warsaw Biennale 2019. Recent publications and catalogs include Nosso Lar Brasilia from Yapsam Books 2014, Stateless Democracy with co-editors Dilar Dirac and Renee Indermau, BAK 2015, and Steve Bannon, A Propaganda Retrospective with Hetnoy Institute 2018, and most recently, I think, Propaganda Art in the 21st Century, out on MIT Press 2019. Jonas completed his PhD research on propaganda art at the PhD Arts program of Leiden University in the Netherlands, and it's my great pleasure to introduce him. Welcome, Jonas.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for this wonderful introduction, and thank you for the invitation to Carola for her contribution, as well as Radha, who I am always very happy to be in conversation with. I think Carola already made some very important points when it comes to the question of transformative change, which I think also resonates with the way that Radha, in a very fundamental way, is challenging the knowledge base and the way it translates to contemporary institution, the heritage of Enlightenment, capitalist colonialism, etc., as a challenge that stands for a fundamental infrastructural, but also social transformation. Carola also made the interesting point about creating a larger us, an us that would not be reduced to the human actor, but that would include new forms of comradeship established with non-human, other than human, more than human actors. I think that also relates very strongly to what Radha is saying about this essentialization of rights, human rights, the liberal components in the human rights regime that individuate rights to the idea of a sovereign individual, which denies what I take from Radha's work from her book What's Wrong with Rights as the important interdependent nature of rights. What Radha seems to be calling for is a redistribution of rights, not human rights, but of rights, in which we start to understand that harming the rights of a river inevitably also includes harming the rights of all the plant life, animals, and humans that exist in a codependency with that river. That makes already clear that in the context of climate crimes, because that of course is what our current climate catastrophe is, a set of subsequent climate crimes, makes clear that in that context rights can never be individuated in that precise sense. These just as very short thoughts on what Carola and Radha already contributed to this conversation. For me, an important part of my research in the past period of time has been related to climate propagandas and the way that crisis imaginaries manifest as propaganda. And with propaganda in this case, I mean the way that infrastructure, narratives, imaginations attempt to construct a particular worldview, a new normal, a manufacturing of consent. And particularly in moments of crisis and destabilization, we see an arena emerge in which there is a struggle over establishing the consensus through and post-crisis. This is very clear in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, in which we have various actors, the let's say global capitalist class on one hand, which in various ways is implicated in creating the conditions for this pandemic to emerge in the first place, but are now trying to nonetheless present themselves as the only infrastructure that can save us, that can help us to return to a normal which is so inherently and criminally intertwined with the disaster that we are witnessing. But this is the propaganda narrative that they are spinning around that crisis. We see another propaganda narrative from the side of the extreme right that has engaged in a perpetual racialization of the virus. The virus is the other. That's already Carola already made reference to that. It manifests in hate crimes against people of Asian descent, very often not Chinese. Already also shows another level of racialization, the incapacity of particular white global northerners not to be able to distinguish between different people from the larger Asian community. But we also saw the way that Orban used the crisis, the pandemic, to suspend parliament altogether, equate the migrant, equate the refugee with a virus, the refugee, the body of color, the migrant as a virus. Here we saw textbook propaganda strategies emerge, very similar to famous case studies like that, like the film Der Eeuwige Jude, produced as a supposed documentary in the period of the Nazi regime, in which, through a very insidious form of editing, Jewish people were equated with rats and vermin, and we've seen a very similar strategies being employed here. So that's just as an example of how moments of crisis are used to spin various, sometimes overlapping but very often conflicting propaganda narratives that aim at establishing their hegemony in a cultural sense, in the sense of control over the infrastructures that create the new post-crisis normativity. And I think in the case of climate propagandas, we see something very similar. The neoliberal take, the libertarian take on the climate crisis has very fundamentally been about perceiving catastrophe as resource. So the climate crisis is a market opportunity. It's a market opportunity for geoengineering. It's a market opportunity for creating new libertarian floating islands where the state has withered away and the darkest imaginaries of Silicon Valley can finally manifest. It is a market for creating space colonies through the likes of SpaceX of Elon Musk to create new to create the escape route, the backup planet for the Earth's 1%. We've also seen another climate propaganda narrative developing around the specter that is referred to as eco-fascism. So far, we always presumed that the danger posed by alt-right and ultra-nationalist forces in relationship to the climate catastrophe is their denial of the science. But as people as Naomi Klein have pointed out, it is of course much more dangerous when a fascist start to believe in climate change, because that obviously will not lead to a new understanding of a necessary planetary redistribution of rights, reparations, and a degrowth paradigm. It will lead to an argument to double down on the question who has the racial right, who is racially entitled to survive. And the current extremely dangerous myth of overpopulation that unfortunately is not only used by the extreme right, but has also become popularized in liberal circles. And think then of the recent documentary by Jeff Gibbs, produced by Michael Moore, Planet of the Humans. Here we see a propaganda that is using crisis, the climate catastrophe, to propose a narrative of genocidal engineering. And what these narratives share, the neoliberal narrative, the eco-fascist narrative, is that they essentially look at the climate catastrophe as something that does not have an agency in and of itself. So they see the climate catastrophe as metaphor or as raw material to build on their pre-existing violent ideological schemas. And that is different from other climate narratives, let's call them emancipatory propagandas, that we can see in platforms like, for example, that of the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal, despite all of its problems when it comes to an idea of green industrialism, which is an inherent paradox, as I think Radha already made very clear, and also Carola referenced to the danger of this green capitalism. But I think the Green New Deal at its core is trying to do something more than that, namely to change with the climate. It is not about seeing the climate catastrophe as a metaphor or as raw material, but as a chance of fundamental transformation with the climate. We are now living in a changed, damaged ecology. It includes plastic hurricanes. It includes toxic fires, and due to the feedback loops, these will be here to stay. Now the question is whether our perspective is based on a perpetual desire to return to a normal that was fundamentally criminal and oppressive in the first place, or if we see this as a moment to fundamentally challenge the political, social, economic institutions that so far have guided us into this disastrous path that is often referred to as progress, a progress that makes the very notion of futures impossible. And as a last point, I think for artists like myself, the question is, how can we contribute our artistic competences to these kind of narratives emerging from the Green New Deal, narratives emerging also from the Black Lives Matter movement right now. Their call, defund the police, is a fundamental demand for institutional transformation, is a fundamental demand to undo the predatory logics that underlie and that maintain our institutions, whether these are the institutions of the police, of education, etc. These are also calls for fundamental transformation. How can we as artists contribute to that process? And for me, an important process in that sense has been the dialogue with Radha through her work that is articulating this notion of rights as interdependent, rights as intergenerational, rights as something that do not belong to the human, that are not a property, and that cannot be understood in this individuating idea of sovereignty, but rights as something that exists through another kind of time scale. One of the things that we've been talking about, that we've been working on, is to create what we call a climate tribunal to prosecute climate crimes, not only climate crimes of the past in the way that they are inherently intertwined with the history of capitalist colonialism and the climate crimes of the present, but the way that climate crimes taking place now impact the life of the rights of unborn plant life, animal life, and humans of the near future. How do we prosecute climate crimes in the here and now on the full weight of their eradication, their ecocidal and thus also genocidal eradication of the future? I think here an artistic imaginary can contribute to expanding on, can contribute by building on ideas, this expanded idea of redistributive rights that Radha proposes, but in terms of thinking of a space, of a set of symbols that can trigger and mobilize and agitate us to really think of, it's not climate change, it's a climate catastrophe. Climate crimes is ecocide, is genocide. That we have to create the imagery to make the fundamental weight of that destruction visible and tangible. We have to feel the affective dimension of fear, a fundamental fear and pain for what we are losing, and a desire to reclaim a space of meaningful survival. Sorry, I probably have taken much too long and was very much taken away by the response to the previous talk, so I will end it here.
Thank you, Jonas. I forgot to mention at the beginning of my introduction to this event that viewers on the YouTube stream are encouraged to write in questions in the comment section of that stream, and they'll be carried over to us here. And as I see them, I'll start to lay them out for our participants. We are now 1 hour in, so I would suggest we take about 10, 15, or 20 minutes to respond to any of the ideas that were put on the table so far by the three speakers. I will just say really, really quickly, maybe to kick things off, that there's I'm hearing a couple of sort of resonances across each of the three contributions that you made. One of which is that there's a kind of, and this gets back to what Radha was speaking about on her second point regarding the certain kind of violent epistemic structure to knowledge production as we understand it today, as it gets co-opted and funded and operationalized by the military-industrial complex. There seems to be a tension in what each of three of you are saying, a deliberate tension between the level of ideation or the values or the sort of way in which we imagine the future and so on, right? To get back to the title of the event, the imaginary on the one hand, and then the structures that prevent us from actually materializing or practicing the ideas that we understand as necessarily progressive, but for whatever reason, we can't actualize or practice them. And there's a tension between those two things. And so I'm wondering if actually we can sort of spend a minute thinking about how within each of your own, let's say, domains or specializations or practices, you actually understand your relationship to knowledge production, right? You all work within domains that are knowledge intensive, right? So I know Carola, for instance, you work on research vessels, right? And you're working between NGOs, and NGOs, among other things, are also knowledge producers. Jonas, I know you are really committed to a kind of experimental and research approach, or artistic approach to knowledge production, and your concluding comments about the propaganda and the imaginary is also about sort of contesting the sort of the hardened forms of imaginary that we inherit, and trying to produce new ones and break through those. And of course, Radha, you were talking about a renewed enlightenment. I wonder if we can think about, if we can get back to like the epistemic, right? The structures through which knowledge is produced and then legitimated as actually precisely the space where the ideational and the material meet, right? Where, in other words, we can tinker with the relationship between those two things and actualize things that appear to be counterintuitive, or against a certain neoliberal rationality, or against the violence of othering, as Carola was talking about it. So the question is really like, how do you understand your own practice in relation to knowledge production? What kinds of knowledge, what kinds of archives of knowledge do you draw from? And then how do you understand your own practice as contributing knowledge within those domains, if that makes sense?
How do you want us to answer? Do you want us to call?
Whoever wants to jump in. We can also take up any questions that you have in relation to each other's talks, but I thought I'd just get us back to the question of knowledge because I saw it as one of the threads through each of your contributions.
Right. Okay. I'll go first. How do I see my role as in the knowledge production institution? Okay. I'll answer that partly as a personal thing, what I do, and partly as a reflection of the way in which we all operate. As I said before, I mean, in capitalist society, in particular neoliberal capitalist society or post-war society, post-World War society, knowledge is a commodity. And we become wage workers in the knowledge industry. Yeah, we are no longer intellectuals. We are no longer thinkers. We have a job, and this is one of the main, and this happened first and foremost in science, where science went from being, an inventor in a garage who invented all these, we have in the Victorian era, a lot of stories about experimenters and, inventors and all of those things. They were interesting characters. But since the World War, science has become a large institutionalized operation where thousands of people work as wage workers to produce things which they don't even know how it's going to be used. For example, Einstein said after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, if I'd known these people were going to do this, I would have been a shoemaker. Yeah, and this is Einstein, right? One of our greatest scientists of the world, because they really didn't know. They just thought democracy will prevail and then, everything will go inside. Anyway, so there are real institutional constraints. And I think one of the things that we as academics don't realize is we are not intellectuals. So the intellectual role has to come from somewhere else. Yeah, and that is why, speaking for myself, I don't see the university as the only space for knowledge production or an exclusive space for knowledge production, nor do I see the university as, this free thinking space. And that is why I continue to engage with outside world. And I learn a lot from the communities I work with. Yeah. And I think my role as a teacher does not stop after I finish my lectures, that it continues out. In fact, I do more meaningful education outside the university sometimes than I think, I'm able to do within. So there are all those things. But key thing is to recognize the institutional constraints and to be realistic about, what these universities are. Increasingly with neoliberal reforms, universities want us to do impact activity. And they say, oh, we want our research to be meaningful to everybody. We want you to go and, engage with communities. And effectively what they mean is, we will decide what knowledge you should produce through our funding mechanisms, through our various other, calls, grant writing, whole lot of technical issues there. And then you go and transmit that knowledge to the outside world. And I think it is about being conscious about those things, because I still have to pay my bills. I still have to work. And that's the reality. But I still have to be something more than just producing knowledge for the knowledge markets. And it's recognizing that as well, that my job does not exhaust my role as an educator or thinker.
Jonas, do you want to jump in?
Yes, but I'll keep it a little bit short because I already spoke longer just a moment ago. But I think to take the example of this model of the climate tribunal that Radha and me are working on in relationship to together with Framer Framed, I think that shows for me what is very important about my artistic methodology is, first of all, to be directly involved and implicated with the subjects that you are putting to the table. It is not about illustrating a theme. It's not about decorating a debate. It's really about trying to think of how, in this case, art, law, activism, academia, how they work in and through one another. Not to be afraid of this old dogmas and shadows of instrumentalization of art, because art is continuously being instrumentalized as a market commodity in hypercapitalism, or as a way of getting some quick tax cuts. So this whole idea of an autonomy of art really needs to be eradicated with. I think for me as an artist, as cultural worker, I want to think through and with the collective and common imaginaries that are manifesting through popular power, through popular mass movements, in this case, through the climate justice movements, not to illustrate it, but to contribute to it, in our case, by trying to create a space where we can start to think, organize hearings, to start to think of how to effectively enforce intergenerational climate justice, effectively shame and make visible and provide evidence of the climate crimes taking place in our present that are eradicating our future as we speak. And that process is a process in which I contribute a certain element of let's say an artistic competence, a way of thinking through form, through spatial organization, through performativity, but this is continuously informed by political ideas and political imaginaries. They work in a continuous intersection. So I would say it is a knowledge that is deeply interdisciplinary, but that also demands being implicated, that demands thinking of cultural work not as something that stands outside of the project of political transformation, but that it has to truly be situated and solidary within it. Yes.
Yeah, and I think, and Jonas, I see in your work a real commitment to like the question of embodied knowledge production, the ways in which you have to actually practice and perform a certain kind of idea before the idea takes shape, and it has to be in common or collective, in a kind of collective. And so that's sort of what I wanted to think about as well, is like, there's various genres of knowledge production. I think the affective and the embodied is one that is sort of typically devalued, right? Or not legitimated in the same way that other kinds of knowledge is valued. Carola, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I could just maybe tell a bit about my personal story of working on the polar research vessels. Because in the beginning, when I was 23, when I started to work there, I just saw all these scientists who, many of them since decades, were really collecting their scientific evidence to present it to the institutions, which they were hoping would then take the political action. They really saw that as something like a divided labor, like the science really purely collecting the scientific data and then passing it on to the politicians, who would then analyze the data and do their jobs and provide for the solutions which would be the best to the benefit of all of society. And I think in the beginning, I tended to believe the people who were pointing me to this kind of incremental positive steps, which really had happened, like a marine protected area which had been created, some quotas on fishing which were in place, and some little improvements which had been made. But then, of course, overall, the trends for biodiversity remain very negative, and I found it more and more difficult to really believe those scientists who still have the opinion, some of them, really depends who you talk to, that science could be in any way independent from the political systems, because you have to apply for your funding. Not a lot of proposals actually get the funding, so that in itself is a political process. And then the data of your science isn't really analyzed objectively. It's always seen, particularly when you talk about nature conservation, it's always seen in contrast to the economy and to the value systems that we have as a society, where we always seem to value the growth of the economy much more than the protection of, let's say, a certain whale species, or even worse than some what often is called charismatic megafauna, like protecting some earthworm in the bottom of the ocean, you know. So that really has made me very skeptic. And still, when I think about, say, some progressive proposals like creating an ecocide law as one of the Rome statutes, as has been suggested already in '72, and where there is now some new movement behind those suggestions, particularly from the small island states. So saying that you could prosecute huge companies who have significantly contributed to the destruction of the environment, and then leading to the deaths of people as well. Then we always come back to addressing those same institutions, which are part of the problem, either to the nation states or even to the international community. And that's true as well if we talk about, for example, the creation of nature rights and having nature having rights in itself. For example, in New Zealand or in India, I think some particular river systems have been given a right to exist in itself, or we see that in the constitutions of Ecuador and Bolivia. There have been some steps of giving nature a right to exist in itself, which is very positive, but is still anchored in the nation states, which are, I think, really part of the overall problems which we are facing. So how to really change the laws from a kind of grassroots perspective and where to anchor them, that is something which I find extremely difficult. But maybe there is, in fact, really a need for being more imaginative and thinking about this topic very differently. But I would say that commonly our thinking really is very strongly connected to the international community and the nation states.
Well, and just to pick up on one of the things you were saying there as well, Carola, about the constraints placed on academic funding, right? Especially in the scientific community, and the ways in which there are, the priority areas or the mandates that are usually configured at the level of the state, at least for state funding, or at the level of the EU, for instance, the European Research Council, prioritize a certain kind of impact or outcome that is modeled on the logic of a patent, right? And so you have to sort of produce a kind of value in your research, and you have to plug that into how you pitch it. And so this actually is a nice transition to one of the audience questions that we just got from Angelica, which is, what does the panel think about academic institutions engaging and seeking for the support of social movements and activists in the decolonizing the curriculum conversation. And I think we can expand that and think more generally, like, are there ways, staying on the question of knowledge production and the epistemic, the politics of epistemic knowledge production, is there a way to actually hijack some of those mandates and instrumentalize channels of funding within the university, precisely to address some of the things that we're thinking about, and to resource and ally with communities and struggles that don't really fit the mold of academic funding structures? I'm wondering if anybody has experience with that or has any thoughts on that. Radha?
Do you want me to go? Okay. Yeah, that's very much the conversation we are having now in the UK about decolonizing curriculum, etc. And it's very interesting because to see how this very conversation we are having now on institutions and knowledge and constraints and so on, actually playing out before our very eyes as we speak now, because this is very much the conversation that is going on. And for many years, for many decades, I would say, many of us, people of academics of color, have engaged in decolonizing curriculum. We have taught, various other things, and we have our modules have sensitized year after year students towards Global South, etc., etc. And now we are seeing all these young people on the streets, and nobody is asking the question, where did they learn about Winston Churchill and his role in the Bengal famine? Where did they learn about Colston and his slave trade? Somebody has taught them, isn't it? And so it's very interesting for many of us who have been doing this for a very, very long time to suddenly come and see that there is a riot on the streets and there are statues being brought down. And then suddenly within the institutions, people who have been doing this for many years are elbowed out. The space is taken over by white liberals. Occasionally they incorporate a young, person of color who does not know the institutional logic. They're very careful to do that. And then this whole discourse is taken away out of the hands of people who know something about it and who have worked on this. It's taken over by the middle ground. And then there's a process of sifting that starts. And it's already happening. We saw that with Islamophobia. Now we are seeing that with, people of color. So then there were the good Muslims and the bad Muslims. Oh, we love the Muslims, but some of them are not too good. So we need anti-terrorism laws for them. Exactly the same thing is happening now with the colored people of color. Yeah. Well, we love Black people. Who said we don't love Black people? Some of them are becoming extreme. See, they're bringing down statues. And so that sifting process starts. And that then creates a whole new logic within the community. Because instead of then coming together, Black people will start thinking, oh, maybe, it's good to protest, but not bring down statues. And the whole focus of that shifts from the fundamental issues about which we have been speaking for many, many years. And I think that, and many young people, academics of color do not recognize this logic because they've not been through the institutional hoops. Typically, they are new PhD students, and they want to further their career, etc., etc. As far as grants are concerned, now it has become explicitly market-oriented, as Carola pointed out. It has become explicitly, they give out the calls, they make the political decision. Now, you see with COVID, immediately, as soon as the pandemic started, funding institutions in UK at least shifted all their major funding to Corona, including saying to academics, if you already have funding for some other project, you can now use it for Corona. So you can see the kind of resources that are going into this whole thing, and what will come of it, we don't know. But I mean, one can imagine what will go into that. So this is a lot thing that has been going on for some time. So I mean, I'm not sure if that answers the question, but those are my thoughts on that initially.
Jonas, did you want to jump onto this question, or do you want us to move to the next audience question?
I mean, as a very short response, I think also in length of what Carola was saying, was saying before, and what Radha is adding now, we're in a way talking about building on a people science, building on a people's culture, and rethinking about which sources of knowledge and from which backgrounds which we trust and what we act upon. To think also of science and culture as something embodied, as we discussed before, but also as there's no neutrality here. There's no neutrality. If you to research the collapse of our living ecosystem is not a neutral, is not and can never be a neutral process. The very fact that we would cultivate somehow being a bystander of collapse as something that proves academic credibility is utter madness and is suicidal. And I think that what Radha is saying about the Black Lives Matter movement that we see right now, it's in a way, this is an incredibly powerful example of people science. There has been this enormous this enormous right-wing backlash to the destruction of public property and the statues, and shouldn't we contextualize them and just hang some additional information? This movement is contextualizing. This movement is educating. When you build a gray box around Churchill in London and it says "Don't open, racist" inside, that is educating. That is contextualizing. Taking off a statue of a colonizer, white supremacist symbol, that is creating a new image. People took over that pedestal as a public theatrical space, as a space of public speech, as a space of a new public and common imagination. I mean, that is people science in its core.
Right. No, I think that's a really strong point, especially the question of contextualization. And actually, it sort of gets to this next question that I think we should move to by Evie. It's more of a conceptual question, but I think it actually speaks to some of the like each of you made a kind of an intervention that is, so for Carola, for instance, you wanted us to think about an expansion of the concept of us and who that includes, right, to the non-human, but also overcoming some of the discourses of othering that you see animated in the so-called migrant crisis. And Jonas, this is actually directed at one of your provocations, but I think, so the question is, I'm interested to ask how each of the panelists conceptualize climate justice. What processes or actions at individual or government levels count as justice, and how can we act immediately within this crisis? So for Jonas, for instance, I see that as also asking you to think a little bit about the question of crimes, right, of climate crimes, especially a concept of crime that materializes outside of a juridical context. In other words, in the tribunal that you're proposing with Radha, right? What does it mean for an arts institution like Frame or Frame to become the context for the measure of crimes? I really like the provocation, but I think the question is also asking us to think about how to conceptualize these kinds of categories outside of the places or structures that are typically tasked with measuring them. You want to kick it off, Jonas?
Very, very fundamental question. What is climate justice? I would say climate justice relates to intergenerational the support, the enforcement of intergenerational egalitarian life forms, and that means that, exactly as what Carola was saying earlier on, that our acts in the present should coexist with a knowledge of our ancestors, however problematic, certainly speaking as a Dutch person, those ancestors are in having created the conditions for the climate crimes that we are living the experiences of today, and of descendants. So, and there are obviously concrete, measurable policies and propositions that relate to that. The redistribution of rights. Carola mentioned the examples of the recognition of rights of rivers and forests. Radha, I think, makes very important additional steps in rethinking who is entitled to give rights to who in the first place, and on what historical genealogy is this whole idea of rights that have led to the idea of human rights. What is the history that has benefited from these rights, and how are our ideas of property ingrained in those rights, and how can we ever think of creating rights, enforcing rights between human, non-human, other than human actors, as long as that property conception, this of course is where the fundamental violence lies, in the idea of property. And that also reflects on how we talk about nature as something external. It's humans in relationship to nature, the fundamental nature-culture divide. But of course, the practice of climate justice is supporting intergenerational egalitarian life forms. That means that relates to a redistribution of planetary wealth, that relates to colonial reparations, that relates to degrowth as a model, that relates in the Green New Deal platform, recognizes frontline leadership in indigenous community, peoples of color who are already living the consequences of climate crimes that the climate panel of the UN still says that projected at the time 12 years, and you think, yeah, but 12 years for who exactly? For who? For the people? For the violent, the instrumentalization of climate crimes as violence, the herbicide in Gaza, the enforcement of monoculture by the Assad regime in indigenous Kurdish territories, the sinking islands. I mean, to who are we talking when we say there are 12 years? There were never 12 years, or there are 12 years, but for a very particular class of people who are privileged in the distribution of rights as we know them today. Anyway, this is just as a first sketch answer to this very profound question that obviously that impacts. To think of intergenerational climate justice impacts so many interconnected realms at the same time.
Radha, do you want to speak a little bit about how you understand the relationship between rights and environmental justice?
Yeah, I mean, I will just respond to that. First of all, by flagging out that the concept of justice is not something that any state gives. It is not a concept that governments give, and it is definitely not an idea that law gives. So I think we need to disassociate the idea of justice from the state, from the law. This is what the European Enlightenment did, and I have already talked about that. We need to disassociate that. Justice is a fundamental aspect of human existence, which comes out of our sociality, because human beings are herd animals. We can only live in a herd. And because if you have to live in a herd, you need to have some sense of common life. And justice comes out of that sense of community and common life that we must necessarily have. If a child is born and there is no one to look after it, it's not going to live for very long. That's how deeply entrenched our sociality and our social being is. And justice comes out of social life, the sense of justice. So I think it's important to flag that up. And coming to about art and what that can do. If I didn't know an artist like Jonas, for example, there would be no way I can even articulate these ideas. I could write some academic article and some academic will read it and it will be of no use to anybody. But because there is and this is where the knowledge common ground that I talked about, but because there is somebody like Jonas who thinks like that, it gives people like me an opportunity to articulate that in a way that becomes visible to a large number of people. And I think that is where the question of this measuring of crime that you talked about, Jeff. Yeah, how do we? And it's this tribunal we are hoping will do just that. it will, by putting these people on trial, it might re-articulate and reformulate the concept of justice and bring the concept of justice back to ordinary people who are suffering from climate change, from migrations, from everything. And so let's take that concept of justice away from the states, away from the governments, and put it to the people and say, how does justice look if you are a Nigerian living in Shell's, oil territory, or if you are, whatever. I mean, that's the role that I think we need to play as seekers in a world where our knowledge systems are not making any sense to us. I don't know if I have time, I will just mention one small comparative concept of the apocalypse. Yeah. In the Abrahamic traditions, the Christian tradition, an apocalypse happens when, you violate the orders of God. God has told you not to do this, you do that, and then he sends the flood and he, destroys everything. In the Indian philosophical tradition, an apocalypse is a symptom. It's a symptom when we human beings are not able to think coherently. Then there is an apocalypse. So it's like horses start neighing before an earthquake because they sense the earthquake is coming. So when we are not able to think coherently, it's a sign that the apocalypse is coming. This is the Indian philosophical concept, if you like, of an apocalypse. And what is happening with all of us? We are not thinking coherently. We want climate, but we are not able to change our institutions. We don't want corporations to exploit anybody, but we are not able to challenge the question of legal personality. We don't want migrants to suffer, but we need their bananas, we need the plantation, the agribusiness to go there and take their land because we can't grow our food anymore. So this is the incoherence. And that is why there is this angst that I started speaking about, So yeah, that's in a nutshell.
And Carola, do you want to speak briefly to the question of environmental justice as well before we move to the next question?
Yeah, I think whenever I think about that question, I really come to the topic of restorative justice, of thinking of all the things which have been lost already in the past, because it's not about only what is happening now in terms of emissions, but yeah, we really see 500 years or more of exploitation of the same places and people just by a very small class of European nations. So for me, what is challenging is how to even measure and how you could even give something back to restore and to bring justice into a place, because it basically seems absolutely impossible. First, from the aspect that it is completely incomprehensible to me how you could measure the effect of someone losing their homeland, of somebody losing their livelihoods, of somebody having to move from the place where their families have lived, or even from having to abandon their cultural traditions because the environment has changed so much. Because we're not only talking in economic terms of somebody maybe losing their income as a farmer and then having to move, but we're really talking about something far, far bigger than that, which we cannot even really measure in these units which we're currently used to. So how could we restore, how could we actually give justice? That is something which I think is extremely challenging. And I think in terms of practical things which can be done, I think in the position of, say, white climate activists typically here in the EU, I think the best and necessary step we can do is put resistance to this system at every step. Because what we can see also now with the Black Lives Matter protest and other things is that people have calmly gone through the institutions, and they have whatever they have, for example, tried to get the Colson statue down by going to the right meetings and writing the letters and having petitions and what on. But nothing happened until they actually went, after like years of wanting to have that statue removed, and just they went and they threw it in the channel, right? And I think this is what we have to do also in terms of asking for environmental justice or climate justice. It's really movements like Ende Gelände or so on, which prevent the forest from being destroyed in Germany or the coal to be excavated. It's putting yourself directly in the line. And if you can do it, if it's possible, I really am very supportive of actions where we as Europeans go against those very companies which cause destruction in the global south, and where we can see that these companies which have their headquarters here are directly linked to destruction around the world. And I think that is where we can do tiny actions of trying to restore or trying to create a little bit of an opportunity for justice.
There's one last question from the audience. This one's actually directed at Jonas, and then I thought maybe we could start to wind down a little bit. And I have a question I want to resolve on, which asks us to shift gears a little bit, if that's okay. An hour and 40 minutes on Zoom is, you have to think double it in terms of like the actual energetic output that is required of you. Feels like 4 hours to me. So this question asks Jonas to speak to the question of the ecocide law. So the question is, do you think the change might happen through the ICC, or is the ICC also part of the system we're fighting against?
I think I would. I mean, I agree with Carola's assessment of this continuous tension and frustration of being sent or being told to go the right way, the regular way, through institutions that are not only systematically betraying the causes that we're trying to defend, but that are fundamentally implicated as aggressors. I think at the same time, thinking of Radha's book, her What's Wrong with Rights, there, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Radha, you also describe how, of course, as activists or as progressive lawyers, we are sometimes forced to call upon the protection of human rights, to speak in a language that might not be our own. It's not our chosen language, but that is what works at that moment. I remember Carola references when she helped to get the migrant boat to the Italian shore, to the Italian harbor. She said, well, actually, the Italian government said that I was breaking a law by bringing them in, but I was following maritime law. I am obliged to save them. But of course, that works rhetorically. That is important rhetorically. But of course, the core of it, the core, I imagine, why Carola and Sea-Watch in general is doing what they're doing, is not because they want to follow the law. It's because they want to enact justice. And maybe sometimes the law is on your side, and in these moments you can strategically use it, just as a university department might be on your side, or a progressive scholar, or legal activist, or this is about building strategic coalitions, and part of it, of the effort, of course, is still to maintain, not to believe in institutional power as the resolve, but to still make sure that we have a foot. Let's think of the current Podemos government in Spain, the first left government since the end of fascism. When the coronavirus pandemic hit, the first thing they did was to collectivize, to nationalize, at least temporarily, private healthcare infrastructures, to start working on a basic income, not only for the period of the crisis, trying to implement it for the long run. I don't believe that this is that we can trust government or existing institutions necessarily to lead transformative change. But we do need allies on all levels of organization, and that goes from the ground to progressive politicians and political parties that we shouldn't put our faith in, but that we do need as allies and comrades in the process.
So the last thing I want to do before we wrap up is actually, it's been so exciting learning about your work over the past couple of days, and now getting a chance to think with you. And I know you're all very, very busy despite the conditions that we exist in right now under these various lockdown conditions. I know you're all very busy, and I wanted to invite you actually to tell us about the next project that you're working on, or something you're really excited about engaging with in the next couple of months. So to self-promote a little bit. But then I actually I want us to learn from each other. What's on your bedside table? What are you reading this summer that you think we all need to be reading? What's on the agenda for you, and whose ideas do you think we should be thinking with as we move through the summer period of this crisis? Carola, can we start with you?
Yeah, well, I could start with something easy. The book which I would recommend to read is called The Wall by John Lancaster. And it's basically a dystopia about a future where the climate has significantly changed. And we find ourselves in what is left of the UK. A few happy people still live there, but they have built a wall around the island, and they're defending it of anyone who wants to come in. And I think it's a very good read, which shows us what is already actually happening at the borders of Fortress Europe, but in a very well written way as a novel. So you can maybe recommend it to friends who wouldn't directly want to read about immigration, but that's very much the core of the topic. Yeah, projects I'm engaging with in the next months. I think I'll try to engage more with the Progressive International, which is a network which just has been launched to unite progressive forces, think about new policies, and linking struggles around the globe. I think it's a necessary step to do that, and I try to connect it to more groups and organizations which are working on the issues of biodiversity, conservation and ecology, and see how we could integrate that into the network.
Wonderful, thank you for that. Radha, do you want to go next?
Yeah, well, I've enjoyed this very much, so I have to say that before I go. On the question of what I am reading, unfortunately, I am reading a book that is not in English and not in any of the European languages. So I'm not sure if this is going to be of any help, but it is about a 17th century poet called Tukaram from Maharashtra, from Western India. And he comes from what we call the poet-saint tradition. And that is the tradition that is, if you like, the tradition of rebellion and resistance and all of that in South Asia. And many of these poet saints or philosopher saints, as sometimes we call them, were people who provided those alternate frameworks for thinking and alternate ways of challenging caste, challenging class, challenging gender discrimination, and all of those things. So I am now reading about him. He comes from our region. I mean, Bombay is the capital of Maharashtra. So I'm very sorry that's not of much help. I'm not sure if it has been translated, but I'm happy to look up and see if there are English translations and send it to anyone who's interested. About the project, of course, the main project is working with Jonas next year. And that is as far as, taking the rights project further. And as far as my own academic project goes, I'm working on examining the relationship between corporations and states in capitalism and colonialism through history, and seeing how that brings us to the question of land and security in the present times. So, yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. And Jonas, finally.
I'm also a member of Progressive International and involved in this new platform, which indeed is a very hopeful one, which unplanned was announced in the middle of the pandemic, but was announced exactly at the moment where we realized if we want to stand the chance in the struggles ahead, and the pandemic, this relatively containable pandemic, and what it has shown in terms of the rat race of resources. And massive bailouts of corporations, the maddening growth of wealth of corporations like Amazon and Facebook in their first quarter since the disaster. I mean, it really shows that this disaster is just market opportunity for them, and that we have to respond at scale. And that doesn't mean at scale in terms of replicating certain centralized ideas of the old of the former international, even though there's a lot to learn from the history of the Comintern, but it doesn't mean that we have to scale up in building structural coalitions. That is what Progressive International represents between different types of organizations. So also not to think that the current progressive government in Iceland is a member of Progressive International, for example, but also the Red Nation, indigenous organization. So are social movements, social movements and progressive political parties. We can't get stuck to the institutional language of what counts as an organization, what counts as a readable forms of politics. This is about, I mean, it's what you started your introduction with, Jeff. This is also about opening up a new genre of political forms of action. But I'm convinced that the only way to respond to this crisis, a global crisis, is to respond on a planetary scale. And then I choose consciously planetary because I think a planetary response is something else than a global response. It is about thinking with, through, and as part of Earth as a terrestrial community in the broadest sense of the us that Carola was mentioning before. So I would very much recommend the blueprint section on progressive.international, which has all the kind of basic papers, but also actionable packages when it comes to contributing to the promotion of the Green New Deal, immigrant rights, and resisting deportation. Other basic strategic information. I would think that is definitely the kind of summer read that applies to this to the moment that we find ourselves in now.
Perfect. So we all have our homework cut out for us in preparation for the next event that hosted by Frame Afraid and Goethe, which I think is taking place in July, but you'll have to stay tuned for information about that. Thank you so much, Radha, Jonas, and Carola. It's been lovely meeting you and learning about your work, and I look forward to future collaborations and projects. I bid you all a good night.
Thank you.
Bye.